Why did no one listen when she raised her hand? Why was her voice always the one that drifted past the briefing table like static, ignored before it ever landed? The room had buzzed with confidence. Maps projected on the wall, red lines drawn crisp as if reality would obey them. Young Marines leaned back in their chairs, grinning, their boots creaking against the floor. And in that noise, Captain Anna Cruz sat still, notebook balanced neatly on her thigh, her pencil waiting. She saw something they didn't. The folds of the valley, the ridges too sharp, the ground too open. It screamed trap. She traced those same contour lines under red light long before orders ever came. But when she spoke, her words dissolved into laughter. "Captain, track equipment, not strategy," the colonel said. His eyes never even followed her pointer. That was the rhythm of her days, precision ignored, warnings drowned in swagger, a pilot who carried more silence than recognition. But what they didn't know, what they had never stopped long enough to see, was that Anna Cruz had been building toward this moment her entire life. Her story didn't begin in the briefing room. It began in Red Cliff, Arizona, on land that baked under sun and rattled with dust storms. Her father was a Marine, and when he came home broken by deployments, he still carried himself like every dawn was a drill. He lined soda cans on fence posts at dusk and handed his daughter a rifle too heavy for her 12-year-old arms. "Steady breath," he'd say. "Ease the trigger. Let the shot surprise you." By the time other kids her age were texting under bleachers, Anna was dropping every can with quiet discipline. She didn't need to boast. The silence after the last shot was its own applause. When her father died in her senior year, she enlisted, not just to honor him, but to prove to herself most of all that the lessons etched into her bones meant something, that his voice, now gone, still lived inside her. She was small, barely over 5 feet, slender, almost fragile-looking compared to the broad-shouldered pilots around her, but what she lacked in bulk she carried in control. She slipped into cockpits like they were built for her, every motion precise, deliberate. She logged her checklists with almost religious devotion. Cannon harmonics, fuel burns, pylon recoil patterns. She scribbled them all in her green kneeboard until the numbers became more than data. They were the language of survival. Yet at the flight line, no one noticed. Or if they did, it was only to dismiss her. "Quota pilot," a corporal muttered as she walked by, his buddy snickering beside him. "Paper pilot, cardboard doesn't pull triggers." She never looked up, never gave them what they wanted. She just kept writing, steady as a metronome. Dead weight, they called her. Mascot, check-the-box pilot. Even the officers joined the chorus in softer tones. "Cruz is fine for support," one told the ops officer. "Keep her on comms. Don't waste her in real fights." So they didn't. They gave her logistics, gear runs, radios, safe work, silent work. The kind no one thanked you for and no one remembered. But what they couldn't see, because they never cared to look, was that Anna Cruz had built her own flight program in the quiet corners of the night. While others traded jokes in the smoke pit, she spread sectional charts across her bunk under a red flashlight. She memorized terrain lines until she could close her eyes and see valleys etched in her mind. She logged wind shifts at different times of day. She rehearsed runs on simulators until her inputs smoothed into instinct. And when the rest of the compound slept, she worked her kneeboard like scripture, rows of numbers, arrows across grids, a private doctrine no one would ever read. She had a tattoo hidden under her sleeve, small, understated, pilot wings with a tiny warthog silhouette. She earned it in a school that punished hesitation and demanded perfection. But out here, she kept it covered. She didn't need to remind men already certain she didn't belong. That was Anna's paradox. She never flared when mocked, never argued when dismissed. She carried insults the same way she carried checklists, quietly, carefully, with patience. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was waiting for the moment she knew was coming. The compound itself ran on routine. Patrols rolled out. Reports trickled back. Marines lined up in the chow hall, trays scraping metal rails, banter ricocheting off concrete walls. Anna sat apart, her helmet at her side, notebook in her lap, always writing, always calculating. And then came the order. 480 Marines, attachments included, would sweep a valley intelligence promised was lightly defended. On paper it looked simple. Clear the ground, stabilize, return. Maps sold it as routine. But the contour line screamed something different. She sat in the back of the briefing, listening, her pencil hovering over paper. The valley narrowed like a fist, ridges pressed high on three sides, kill zones waiting to ignite. "Sir," she said, raising her hand, her voice even calm, "this valley could be a deliberate trap. These folds here," she pointed, "they can hide forces in strength. It looks too clean, too easy." The colonel barely glanced at her. "Captain, you're here to track equipment, not strategy." Laughter rippled through the room. A private mimed scribbling notes, smirking. She shut her notebook, stayed quiet. And when it wrapped, she watched from the back as 480 Marines geared up, rifles slung, helmets strapped, confidence untouched by doubt. They filed into transports, dust rising behind them as the convoy crawled toward the valley's mouth. Her orders: support duty, monitor comms, track logistics, stay out of the way. She carried out her task with the same discipline as ever, logged calls, checked radios, but her chest felt tight as the silhouettes of those trucks shrank against the horizon. She had envisioned this valley long before the order came. She had traced every line. She knew exactly how it could close, and now they were walking into its jaws. The first reports came easy: position checks, fuel tallies, routine chatter. But then the rhythm cracked. One call never came. Another overlapped, frayed. Someone shouted for dismounts. Another cursed at an engine that wasn't failing. And then it came. The sound you only hear once and never mistake. The break in a man's voice when the world ahead of him explodes. "Contact, contact." "Static." Another net cut in. "Taking fire, East Ridge." A third voice tried to report, folded into breath and silence. Drone feeds flickered with muzzle flashes, bright across every ridge. Convoy dots froze mid-screen. Smoke pulsed from gullies. The room went still. The watch officer lowered his headset, eyes unfocused. A lieutenant skimmed a checklist, finding no line for this. "Hold position," the major said finally, voice clinging to doctrine. "Wait, follow protocol. Too hot inside 200 meters. No air support authorized." On a side monitor, helmet cam footage shook with breath, dust flying as Marines clawed into the dirt. Rounds chewed earth at their boots. Anna stood at the back, eyes locked on a drone angle just teasing the crown of an enemy gun pit. She counted bursts in her head, mapped the traverse, saw what no one else did. Her palm pressed against the leather of her flight jacket. She knew the angles, the distances, the solution. And for the first time in months, she spoke. "I can end this." The word slipped from her lips, soft, certain. But no one turned. Not yet. How long could a room full of men stare at screens and convince themselves they weren't watching a massacre? The major repeated the line like a shield. Too hot inside 200 meters. No clearance. His voice wavered, but he clung to the phrase as though repetition could erase the feed in front of them. On the monitors, fire stitched across ridgelines. Convoy dots huddled in the dirt, shrinking by the second. A squad leader's voice cracked through the net, panic fraying his words. "We are pinned, casualties. Can't push, can't pull back." Silence swallowed the rest. A captain at the table lowered his eyes, as if avoiding the screen would make him less complicit. A lieutenant clicked a pen against his checklist, unable to cross off a single line. Anna stood at the back, jaw tight, her fingers curling around the edge of her kneeboard. She counted the bursts on the feed again, steady, predictable. She saw the traverse of the eastern gun pit, the way its pauses lined up like a cruel metronome. Geometry, angles, solutions. Her chest rose slow. She breathed the way her father taught her. And she said it again. I can end this. No one looked at her. Not the colonel, who stared at doctrine like it was a lifeboat. Not the major, who clutched rules like rosary beads. Not the captains, who busied themselves with meaningless clicks and notes. But someone had heard. A first sergeant near the door turned, his voice sharp. Captain, where are you going with that? Anna hadn't moved yet, but her hand was already at the zipper of her flight kit. By muscle memory, she was feeling for gloves, for her checklist, for the ritual she'd performed 100 times alone in simulators. Out, she answered simply. The sergeant barked her name, but before his voice filled the room, another broke through the radio, ragged, desperate, raw. Bravo pinned, losing men. The words snapped in half under gunfire. The colonel's jaw clenched. The 200-meter rule stands, he said, louder this time, as if volume could enforce obedience. And just like that, the room decided. Waiting was safer than choosing, doctrine less dangerous than disobedience. Anna looked once more at the feed, Marines clawing at dirt, smoke curling from burning transports, enemy muzzle flashes like relentless stars. She whispered softer but steadier, I can end this. They ignored her. So she didn't wait. Helmet under her arm, she walked out. Her boots struck the concrete with a rhythm steadier than her pulse. Through the compound she moved, past Humvees crusted with dust, past crates reeking of fuel. The dog tag her father once wore tapped against her vest, every step marking its presence. She didn't run. Running was panic, walking was discipline. At the flight line, her warthog sat crouched under the desert sun, pylons loaded, cannon harmonics already checked. She moved through the ritual like she always did, straps tightened, HUD aligned, kneeboard tucked under her thigh. She whispered every checklist as if the words themselves steadied the airframe. The engines spooled to life, turbines clawing hot air into rhythm. Canopy fogging, glass catching sun. Her hands on the throttle quadrant, the stick an extension of her fingers. The ground shrank below her as she climbed shallow, hugging the terrain. She kept low, sliding along ridgelines, every movement a memory rehearsed in the quiet of lonely nights. From above, the valley opened. It was worse than she imagined. Columns stalled, vehicles burning, men crawling into gullies, rifles flashing against ridges lit like fireflies, RPG teams hunting from shadows. Anna eased the stick, settled the HUD. The GAU-8 cannon whispered through the frame as she lined her first pass. One burst, half a second steady, surgical. The eastern gunpit crumpled. Silence followed like a held breath. Then the net erupted. Who's shooting? Do we have air cover? Negative, no CAS cleared. Anna didn't answer. She was already banking, already lining up her next run. An RPG team bent to shoulder a launcher at a smoking Humvee, 70 meters from Marines pressed flat against rock. She measured wind drift, arc distance, released a rocket. The launcher vanished in dirt and smoke before it could fire. The voices on the net shifted, from panic to confusion, from disbelief to something close to awe. This isn't artillery, not a drone. Who's cutting the ridges? Anna stayed silent, fingers steady, breath calm, world narrowed to geometry. She dipped lower, carving the valley like she'd traced in her notebook. Each burst wasn't about kills. It was about threads. Cut this gunner, the flank phrase. Remove that team, a lane opens. Seconds bought, breaths gained. Every run added time, and time in a Killbox was life. The net wavered, then steadied. A voice cut through, rough and commanding. Commander Roar, the SEAL commander moving with the battalion. Who the hell's covering us? For a moment no one answered. Then a calm tech, eyes wide, whispered into the channel. Viper 206. Silence heavy and charged. Then Roar's voice again, softer now, like recognition dawning. Viper 206, that's Anna Cruz. No one believed it at first. Dead weight, the quiet pilot, the one they'd mocked in the chow hall. And yet against the smoke and ridges, the silhouette of a warthog carved through dust like a phantom. Precise, relentless, unstoppable. Colonel Hayes, back in the command center, froze. On the screen, his overlooked pilot was rewriting the battlefield. The one he'd benched, dismissed, ignored, was now the only thread holding the battalion together. Anna never heard the silence that filled the room behind her, never saw the faces pale, the laughter die into shame. She only saw the ridges, the angles, the fight in front of her. Her tattoo caught light as her sleeve tugged back, small pilot wings, warthog silhouette inked in black. Scars laced her knuckles, burns etched into her arm, marks the paperwork never recorded, proof written into her skin. She didn't announce herself, didn't demand recognition. She just kept flying, pass after pass, each one solving geometry where doctrine had only drawn walls. And on the ground, Marines once certain they'd die in that valley began to believe in survival. Because someone was carving a corridor through the Killbox. Someone they'd never expected. How much longer could she hold her orbit before the valley claimed her too? Each pass wrung more from her body. Fingers stiff on the stick, arms buzzing from recoil, oxygen mask pressed against her cheek like a brand. The warthog shuddered under her control, the GAU-8's thunder reverberating through her bones. But she didn't flinch. Every burst had to count. Every rocket had to carve a seam. Below, the valley was chaos stitched into geometry. Smoke curling, vehicles smoldering, ridges crawling with muzzle flashes. Marines scattered in gullies, pressed against rocks, pinned in shadows. She saw them not as strangers, but as coordinates, angles she had rehearsed in the quiet of long nights. Each man a variable in her head, each squad another thread she refused to let snap. Her first passes had stunned them. Confusion still hummed across the net. Voices overlapped, disbelief thick in every syllable. But slowly, that disbelief hardened into recognition. Viper 206 has us covered, one squad leader shouted, his voice breaking like it had just rediscovered hope. The net stirred. The words passed from one radio to the next. Viper's up. Viper keeping us alive. Anna never replied. She stayed silent, carving the valley. Her eyes scanned for patterns. That gunner on the west slope, he swept too predictably. She cut his line with a short cannon burst, dirt spraying him into silence. That RPG team sprinting to reposition. She tracked their knees digging into soil, punched off a rocket, left nothing but smoke where they stood. Every strike wasn't destruction. It was subtraction of anchors, the removal of the forces stitching the Killbox together. Each pass frayed the trap, thread by thread. But each pass also cost her. The warthog wasn't gentle. Its cannon tore through air like a beast, harmonics rattling her ribs. Her forearm burned where old scars tugged against sweat-soaked sleeves. Her grip locked tighter, refusing to shake. She flew low, so low that tracer glints arced past her canopy, enemy fire clawing sky she had to share. Still she pressed on. Inside her helmet, her father's voice rose unbidden. Steady breath. Ease the trigger. Let the shot surprise you. She exhaled, fired, watched the eastern spur go quiet. And then her sleeve slid up again. The tattoo glinted in cockpit light, a small wartime mark no one here had ever seen. Her wings, her warthog, ink she had earned, hidden for months beneath silence. Now it shouted louder than any insult they had hurled. The ground responded. For every seam she cut, Marines shifted. Squads crawled from gullies to cover. Corpsmen dragged the wounded toward burning vehicles now turned into makeshift shields. Each second she bought was another man breathing, another chance. But the trap wasn't giving up. On the western ridgeline, fresh muzzle flashes opened up, angles too steep for squads to escape. On her HUD, she caught the flare of an enemy command node, bodies massing around it, feeding orders into the chaos. She banked hard, the warthog groaning under the G-load, her lungs compressing against the pull. She held it, steady. One run, precise. She lined the cannon, half-second burst, watched the node erupt in dust and silence. Enemy fire faltered, confusion rippling down the slope like a fracture. The net below surged. They're breaking, push, push. Anna didn't smile, didn't even nod, she kept scanning. Every second mattered. Every angle had to be solved. Back in the command post, Colonel Hayes stood rigid, his face carved with disbelief. The room behind him had gone silent. Officers who once mocked her now staring at the feed as if witnessing something impossible. The pilot they had benched, sidelined, dismissed, was rewriting the fight they had already marked as lost. But Anna didn't think of vindication. She thought only of the Marines below. She heard their voices crackle, frantic but alive. A squad pinned near the draw. Another out of ammo, shielding wounded with bare bodies. She shifted her orbit, lined a maverick strike and cleared the ridge above them. The corridor widened, and helicopters began to arrive. Rotor thunder shook dust into choking clouds as the first bird dropped into the space she had carved. Marines scrambled, half dragging, half carrying their wounded, sprinting for the LZ. Her HUD tracked muzzle flashes too close to the landing zone. She fired again, short, controlled, cutting down shooters before they could claw at the helicopters. "First chalk is up," the net reported, "wounded aboard." The word struck deeper than any bullet. For the first time, survival felt real. Anna didn't relax. She couldn't. She banked again, kept the corridor open, her warthog a guardian angel cloaked in dust and fire. She cut threats before they formed, bought every second with recoil and precision. Second bird inbound. She breathed, adjusted trim, fired. Each helicopter lifted into air carrying more than bodies. It carried proof that they would not die here, that someone had refused to let protocol bury them. And then Commander Rohr's voice, rough but steady, filled the net. "Command, this is Trident Actual. Viper 206 has us covered. Repeat, Viper 206 has us covered." The name rippled across the valley. Not dead weight, not mascot, not paper pilot. Viper 206. For the first time, Anna allowed herself a pause, just one heartbeat. She felt it in her chest, not pride, not vindication, something quieter, heavier, duty fulfilled, a promise to her father, to herself, to the men below who now had a chance to see another dawn. But the fight wasn't over. The valley still burned, Marines still bled. She still had passes to make, geometry to solve. So she pushed the stick forward, engines growling, and lined up for another run. Silent, steady, relentless. How much longer could she keep buying seconds before her body betrayed her? The cockpit stank of sweat and scorched metal. Her gloves were slick, fingers cramping from hours of pressure. Her oxygen mask pressed deep lines into her skin, every breath shallow and ragged. The warthog groaned beneath her like a tired beast, yet still answered her hands, still cut the sky with precision. But she knew the limits. She had flown enough hours, drilled enough sorties to recognize the creeping edge of fatigue, the narrowing focus, the tremor waiting just outside her grip. And still she couldn't stop. Below, the valley roared. Muzzle flashes stitched across ridges. RPGs arced like spears against a darkening sky. Helicopters hovered heavy in dust clouds, their rotors chopping through smoke as Marines stumbled into them, dragging the wounded, covering each other with the last rounds they had left. The net crackled with raw voices. Third chalk lifting, corridor holding. Fourth bird inbound, taking fire on approach. Anna banked hard, HUD sliding across her vision. She saw the source, an enemy gunner crouched behind rock, tracer fire clawing dangerously close to the helicopter. She pulled the trigger, cannon harmonics ripping the air apart. Half-second burst, precise. The gunner vanished and the bird clawed into air, free. The Marines inside would live. Another pass, another seam, another second bought. Her chest burned. She exhaled slowly, whispering the rhythm her father taught her. Steady breath. Let the shot surprise you. Her hands obeyed, even as her body screamed. On the net, someone whispered it again, reverent this time. Viper 206. The name traveled, hushed and heavy, as if saying it too loud might break the fragile thread of survival holding them all. Back in the command post, Colonel Hayes stared at the screen like a man watching his own failures unfold in reverse. The officers around him didn't dare speak. They had nothing left to say. Every insult, every dismissal, every laugh in chow halls burned away by the reality in front of them. The pilot they'd mocked was the only reason the battalion wasn't already listed as lost. But Anna didn't fly for them. She never had. She flew for the geometry, for the Marines clawing at dirt below, for the dog tag tapping against her vest, steady as a heartbeat. Another run, another burst, another silence on the ridges where death had been waiting. And still the enemy pressed. On the western slope, fresh signatures lit up her HUD, reinforcements flooding into the valley, desperate to seal the Killbox before the last helicopters could escape. If they locked it again, the corridor would collapse. The battalion would be trapped all over. Anna swallowed hard, eyes narrowing. She had minutes at best. She lined up, fired, rolled, fired again. Each pass surgical, each strike calculated not for destruction but for delay. Keep them off balance. Keep the corridor open just long enough. But her body was failing. Her arms ached from hours of tension. Her eyes burned, vision blurring at the edges. She bit down on the inside of her cheek, sharp pain anchoring her against the fog creeping in. "Command," Roar's voice broke through the net, rough but steady. "Bird 5 inbound. We need that corridor clean." Anna didn't answer. She couldn't waste the breath. She banked, leveled, fired. A machine gunner crumpled, tracers silenced. She swung back, lined another run, clipped the edge of a ridge where a squad was massing. "Corridors holding," a ground voice shouted. "Keep moving." The net shifted. Voices steadier now, less panicked. They believed again, believed they might live. Because she hadn't quit. But inside her cockpit, her pulse hammered, every movement heavier, every breath shorter. Her vision tunneled, HUD symbols glowing too bright against darkening edges. She whispered to herself, "One more, just one more pass." Her father's voice echoed in memory, "Don't rush the shot, don't force it, trust the breath." She inhaled, exhaled, fired. The corridor widened again, and a helicopter dropped into it, rotor blades clawing dust into choking clouds. Marines stumbled toward it, dragging their wounded, shouting, covering, desperate but alive. "Fifth chalk aboard," the net declared. Relief rippled through the frequency, short-lived. Because the enemy wasn't done. On her HUD, a fresh flare ignited, a heat signature racing across a slope, launcher in hand, sprinting toward an angle on the next inbound bird. Too close, too fast. Anna's breath caught. Her hands moved before thought. She rolled hard, engine screaming, pulled the nose down, lined the reticle, fired. The cannon spat flame. The runner vanished into dirt and smoke. The helicopter landed safe. But her own cockpit shook violently, airframe rattling. Warning lights flickered. She steadied her grip, forced the jet level. She couldn't afford damage now, couldn't afford a mistake. "Bird 6 touching down," the net called. "Casualties loading." Anna swallowed, throat dry. She scanned the ridges again, saw fresh muzzle flashes, enemy fighters desperate to claw back the Killbox. She clenched her jaw, banked again, lined another run. Her body begged to quit. Her mind refused. Because down there, 480 Marines waited for every second she could give. She whispered it again, steady and quiet, "I can end this," and dove once more into the valley's fire. How much more could she take before the valley swallowed her whole? Warning lights blinked like restless eyes across her console. Fuel low, ammunition dwindling. Her muscles cramped with every movement, a dull throb racing through her forearms into her shoulders. Her vision blurred at the edges, HUD symbols glowing too bright. But the net below left her no choice. Seventh bird inbound, were still pinned. Anna steadied her breath the way she always had. Steady breath. Ease the trigger. Let the shot surprise you. Her father's voice whispered like a ghost inside the roar of engines. She banked hard, rolled low along the ridgeline and fired. The GAU-8 growled, harmonics reverberating through her bones. A machine gun pit silenced. A rocket team scattered. Another lane open, just wide enough. Corridors clear, move, a ground voice shouted. She felt nothing. No pride, no vindication. Just the weight of one more pass, one more calculation, one more life balanced against her own exhaustion. Through the canopy, the valley was a wound that refused to close. Smoke curled into the sky. Vehicles burned like pyres. Muzzle flashes winked from shadows. And somewhere inside that chaos, Marines clawed their way toward survival because she refused to let them die. Seventh chalk loaded, the net called, bird lifting. For a heartbeat, relief surged. One more group alive. One more miracle snatched from fire. Then the western ridge lit up. Tracer fire raked across the sky, cutting dangerously close to the rising helicopter. Anna banked before the thought fully formed, rolled into a shallow dive, and loosed a rocket. The ridge exploded into silence just as the helicopter cleared altitude. Her chest ached, her hands trembled. But there was no pause. Eighth bird inbound. We've still got men out here. Anna whispered to herself, one more. She lined the pass, sweat streaking her face beneath the helmet. She could almost feel her father's dog tag tapping against her vest, steady, rhythmic, anchoring her when her body begged to collapse. The warthog roared again, cannon bursts tearing through the gully. Marines broke cover, sprinting toward the landing zone. Corpsmen dragged wounded through dust and blood. For each body that moved, she knew her run had bought the breath they needed. Bird 8 lifting, casualties aboard. The corridor narrowed behind it. Enemy reinforcements pushed harder, desperate to seal the valley again. Anna swung back, lined up for another strike, and felt the tremor in her arms deepen. She bit down on the inside of her cheek, sharp pain cutting through the haze. She steadied the stick, fired. RPG team gone, gunner silenced, lane reopened. But her own jet was bleeding. Fuel gauges dipped lower. Ammo counters near empty. She could feel the aircraft's fatigue, the shuddering airframe begging for reprieve. She ignored it. Bird 9 inbound. Another bank, another dive, another pass through fire. And this time, tracers clawed closer than ever, streaking past her canopy in searing flashes. She flinched but held the line, cannon thundering until the ridge went dark. She pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing her chest, black edging her vision. For a moment, she thought she'd fade. But she didn't. Her eyes snapped open, lungs burning, breath ragged. And she whispered again, softer this time, not yet. Below, Marines stumbled into the ninth bird. Some dragged, some carried, some covered with rifles shaking in exhausted hands. But they were alive. Ninth chalk away, the net called. Only one more. Anna's heart slammed in her chest. Her body screamed for rest. But she knew the math. If the last bird didn't make it, everything they'd fought for would unravel. Bird 10 inbound. Last load, we need cover. Her hands shook on the stick. She forced them steady. One more pass. She lined the HUD, saw the ridges crawling with fighters desperate to crush the last hope. She inhaled, exhaled, let the world collapse to angles and wind. The GAU-8 barked, savage and merciless. Gun pits collapsed. A squad scattered in dust. The last lane cracked open, narrow but real. Bird 10 on the ground. Voices on the net surged. Marines sprinting, covering, dragging the last of their brothers. Dust spiraled into the air as the helicopter filled. Anna circled above, vision tunneling, body barely responding. She lined one last pass, suppressing muzzle flashes clawing too close to the LZ. Her cannon answered, controlled, precise. Bird 10 lifting. The words hit harder than the cannon's recoil. The last of them were aboard. The valley was empty of Marines. She exhaled. For the first time, she let her grip ease, her arms trembling with release. She scanned the ridges, watched the helicopters climb free, tracked their silhouettes until they vanished into distance. Zero left behind. The phrase echoed across the net, repeated by squad leaders one by one. Zero left behind. Anna swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. She hadn't cried in years. She wouldn't now. But the words pressed heavy against her chest, heavier than the warthog itself. She had done it. Not for recognition, not for rank, not for the officers who had ignored her. For them, for the 480 souls who would have been names on a casualty roster, erased by protocol. Her father's dog tag tapped against her vest again, steady as a heartbeat. And for the first time, she allowed herself a thought that wasn't calculation. He would have been proud. Why was the silence heavier than the gunfire had ever been? The cockpit stilled around her, instruments glowing steady again, warning lights finally fading to a dull background. Her hands hovered above the stick, trembling now that they no longer had purpose. The valley lay behind her, scarred and burning but empty of Marines. She had carved the corridor, held it open, and watched every last helicopter climb into the sky. Zero left behind. The phrase still echoed in her headset, repeated in ragged voices across the net like a vow renewed. Anna closed her eyes for just a breath, let the words settle into her chest, and then opened them again. Duty wasn't over, not until her bird was on the ground. She coaxed the warthog back toward base, her movements mechanical, precise. Fatigue gnawed at her, but her training held. She landed clean, rolled down the runway, and taxied toward the apron. Engines wound down in a long, hollow sigh. When she popped the canopy, the world outside was dust and silence. But not the silence she was used to, the kind laced with whispers, smirks, and dismissals. This silence was different. Marines lined the path, their bodies battered, uniforms streaked with dirt and blood, helmets tucked under their arms. They stood in quiet rows, eyes locked on her as she climbed down the ladder. No jokes, no mutters, just stillness, heavy and reverent. Her boots touched the concrete, soft against the roar that still rang in her ears. She walked forward, helmet tucked under her arm, shoulders squared by habit. The dog tag tapped against her vest with each step, a quiet metronome inside the hush. At the far end, Colonel Hayes waited. His posture was regulation perfect, jaw locked tight, eyes harder to read. She stopped before him, standing at attention despite the ache screaming through her muscles. He held her gaze. "You disobeyed direct orders." His voice was sharp, clipped, the kind of voice that could end careers. Around them, Marines held their breath. Anna's answer was steady, stripped bare of excuses. "Yes, sir." The pause stretched long. Her chest rose once, slow, steady. If this was the end, so be it. Then Hayes's voice cracked, just enough for everyone to hear. "You saved a battalion." The words landed like a verdict, not shouted, not celebrated, spoken like truth too heavy to bend. For the first time, his eyes didn't look past her, not at her name tape, not at her file, at her. Before she could answer, boots crunched against concrete. Commander Rohr stepped forward, grime streaking his uniform, blood dried at the corner of his helmet. He stopped in front of her, raised his hand in a sharp salute, and held it there. The kind of salute that turned a gesture into a monument. "Viper 206, he said, voice hoarse but formal. "The valley owes you." Behind him, Marines shifted. Helmets came off, heads bowed, whispers carried low. She carried us. Dead weight saved the battalion. No, another voice corrected firm. Viper 206 did. The stillness broke not into cheers but into something deeper. Boots stomping against concrete, hands clapping, voices rising low like a hymn. An ovation that shook dust from rafters, not wild but solemn. A recognition they could never again take back. Anna didn't smile, didn't gloat. She lowered her eyes and said only, "I was doing my duty, sir." Colonel Hayes nodded once, slow and deliberate. The motion itself was an admission of doubt, of error, of everything he had failed to see. Rohr dropped his salute and offered his hand. She shook it, her grip steady despite the tremor in her muscles, scars visible against his calloused palm. For Anna it wasn't vindication, not relief. It was accuracy. She had done exactly what her training demanded, what her father's lessons had etched into her bones, what her kneeboard whispered in long, quiet nights. She had seen the geometry and solved it. The ovation followed her as she walked past, helmet under her arm, boots pressing a quiet trail across the concrete. Her father's dog tag tapped against her vest with every step, steady as a heartbeat. Inside the hangar she began her ritual. Logs open, pencil steady, handwriting precise despite the tremor in her fingers. She recorded fuel burns, cannon bursts, every number in its place. The numbers mattered. The method mattered. Recognition was just noise. But outside those walls, something had shifted forever. The Marines who once mocked her would never again call her dead weight. Officers who had silenced her would never again ignore her hand in a briefing. The silence that once carried jeers was now filled with respect too heavy to name. For the battalion, the story had already begun to live. "We should have died in that valley," they would say, but Viper 206 was watching. Her name no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to the men who lived because she refused to stay silent. Why did the story spread faster than orders ever did? One night was all it took. The battalion hadn't even washed the dust from their uniforms before the whispers left the valley and seeped through every tent, every barracks, every chow line. Marines spoke in low voices not about their survival, but about who had made it possible. Viper 206 held the corridor. She flew through fire. She didn't leave us. The numbers were staggering, 540 men who should have been names on a casualty roster. Yet here they stood, battered, bruised, alive. They repeated the same phrase until it sounded less like fact and more like scripture. Zero left behind. Command struggled to contain it. Colonel Hayes filed his report with words clipped and careful. Captain Anna Cruz executed actions outside protocol. He paused over the next line, staring at the cursor as if truth itself resisted being tamed. Finally, he wrote what couldn't be denied, resulting in the extraction of all personnel. No fatalities recorded from ambush site. It should have ended there. A report filed. An incident buried under regulations. But reports didn't matter when 500 voices carried a different testimony. Marines who had once sneered now spoke her name with a weight that bordered reverence. In the chow hall, where she used to sit alone, trays scraping and laughter rolling past her, silence fell when she entered. Not hostile, not mocking, just silence filled with eyes that had seen her warthog dive through fire when everyone else had looked away. They didn't know how to speak to her anymore, so they didn't, they just made space. At first, it felt no different to Anna. She still logged her numbers, still scribbled her equations on the green kneeboard, still walked with her helmet tucked under her arm. Routine was the only rhythm she trusted. But inside, something had shifted. For years, she had carried silence like armor. Let the insults slide. Let the dismissals pile. Let the weight press her down without cracking her composure. She had waited, not for permission, but for the inevitable moment when numbers and patience would matter more than swagger. That moment had come, and it had changed everything. Yet recognition never sat easily on her shoulders. When Marines nodded at her now, she nodded back but said nothing. When they whispered Viper 206 like a myth, she kept walking. When a young private stammered out, "Ma'am, you saved me," she only answered, "We all made it out. That's what counts." Because for Anna, it was never about being seen. It was about being accurate. But accuracy unsettled command. Higher officers met in closed rooms, voices low but sharp. A captain who disobeyed protocol, who ignored the 200-meter rule, who defied direct orders and succeeded, that was dangerous. Not because it was wrong, but because it worked. And if it worked once, who would stop others from trying? Doctrine demanded uniformity. Anna had proved geometry didn't care about doctrine. Colonel Hayes bore the weight of that contradiction. He had watched her fly, had seen her save the men he was ready to mourn. He couldn't deny her, but he couldn't champion her either. So he walked a narrow line, praising the battalion's survival while mooting the pilot who had made it possible. But soldiers don't live by reports, they live by stories. And this story refused to die. Across outposts, Marines who hadn't been there leaned in as survivors told it. They described the valley like a tomb, the Killbox sealed, the hopelessness pressing into their bones, until a single warthog carved open the sky. They spoke of precision, of cannon bursts that felt less like firepower and more like salvation. They swore they saw her silhouette pass so low they could feel the ground shake. Some called her a ghost, others called her a miracle. All agreed on one thing: she had saved them when no one else would. And Anna. At night she sat alone in the hangar, the warthog crouched silent under dim lights. She ran her hands along its scarred skin, logged every mark, every burn, every calculation. She stripped it down in her records as if numbers could explain what had happened. Fuel burns, cannon bursts, ammunition tallies. But numbers couldn't capture the voices on the net when they said zero left behind. She carried that phrase like she carried her dog tag, close to her chest, steady as a heartbeat. There were moments alone when her hand brushed the small tattoo on her arm, pilot wings, a warthog silhouette, proof she had earned long before anyone believed it. She traced it with her fingers, not in pride but in quiet recognition. Her father's voice came back then, clear as it had been on dusky evenings in Arizona. Steady breath, ease the trigger, let the shot surprise you. He had raised her to believe patience was strength, discipline was survival, and courage wasn't noise. It was silence, steady until the moment it was needed. She hadn't disobeyed, she had followed those lessons to the letter. And though command debated, though reports clipped her down to actions outside protocol, the battalion knew the truth. They told it in whispers, in nods, in the way silence fell when she entered a room. Captain Anna Cruz. Viper 206. The pilot who refused to let them die. What happens to a soldier when the gunfire stops, but the silence follows her everywhere? Days passed, reports filed, convoys repaired. The compound resumed its rhythm, briefings, patrols, chow lines, drills. On the surface, routine returned. But underneath, nothing felt the same. Not for the battalion, not for the Marines who walked out of that valley, and not for Captain Anna Cruz. In the hangar, she moved the same way she always had, helmet under her arm, kneeboard tucked close, pencil scratching across pages of numbers. She logged cannon harmonics, fuel burns, recoil drift. She stripped the warthog down to digits and margins as if precision could insulate her from the weight of memory. But numbers couldn't erase voices. She still heard them, cracked with panic, begging for fire, gasping through static. And she heard something else too. The moment when those voices steadied, when they realized they weren't abandoned, when they whispered her call sign like a lifeline. Viper 206. The name trailed her now, heavier than any rank. She didn't ask for it, she didn't want it, but Marines carried it in their mouths like it had saved them, because it had. In chow halls, men who once scraped their chairs away when she sat down now made space. Some nodded, some lowered their eyes, No one mocked. Silence greeted her instead, thick and respectful. On patrols, young privates who'd barely spoken to her before now stole glances, whispering the story to one another as though she couldn't hear. That's her. She flew the valley. Even sergeants, men carved from deployments and battle scars, met her eyes with something close to reverence. Not pity, not doubt, but respect earned in fire. It should have felt like vindication, but it didn't. For Anna, it was something quieter. She thought often of her father, of the fence posts at dusk, Sodakins lined like targets, his voice steady, never needing volume to carry weight, steady breath, ease the trigger, let the shot surprise you. She had lived that lesson in the valley, lived it in every second she refused to surrender to doctrine, every time she trusted geometry over politics, every pass that carried the difference between a corridor of escape and a coffin of dirt. And now 540 Marines lived because of it. Yet recognition didn't comfort her, it unsettled her. Because command saw it differently. Meetings behind closed doors whispered about her defiance. Reports softened words like saved into executed unsanctioned maneuvers. Doctrine demanded uniformity, and Anna Cruz had proved that survival sometimes lived in disobedience. That was dangerous. Colonel Hayes remained caught in the middle. He had seen her work, seen the battalion live because of her, but he couldn't rewrite doctrine without unraveling the system that gave him command. So he nodded at her in silence, his expression locked between gratitude and guilt. But outside those rooms, the battalion carried a truth that didn't need signatures. They knew she had saved them. And they carried that story with them, back to outposts, back to bases, back to barracks far from Blackthorn Valley. They told it in whispers, in late-night conversations, in the kind of low voices that spread faster than official orders ever could. We should have died there, but Viper 206 was watching. Anna never corrected them, never leaned into the myth. She just kept flying, kept logging numbers, kept waiting quietly as she always had. Because for her, courage was never about noise. It was about silence. At night, she walked the flight line alone. The desert wind clawed across her face. She ran her hand along the warthog's skin, scarred from heat and fire, and felt the hum of a machine that had been more than a weapon. It had been her voice when no one would hear her. She thought about the men who wouldn't forget her name, about the valley that should have been their grave, about the way their voices had steadied once they realized someone was fighting for them, unseen, unheard, relentless. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply stood there, her father's dog tag cold against her chest, steady as a heartbeat. Sometimes at dawn, she saw Marines jogging past the flight line. They didn't call out. They didn't wave. But every head turned her way, eyes locking on the warthog crouched in the light. And in those looks was everything words couldn't hold. Respect, gratitude, reverence. She accepted it in silence, because silence had always been her strength. The story would live, not in official reports, but in the mouths of those who survived, in the voices of Marines who carried the weight of that valley with them for the rest of their lives. They would tell it to new recruits, to families back home, to anyone who asked what courage looked like. They would say, courage isn't loud. It doesn't roar for attention. It waits, quiet and steady until the moment it's needed. And then, without asking for recognition, it acts. Anna Cruz never needed vindication. She never needed their applause. She needed only the accuracy of her father's voice in her memory, the precision of numbers in her kneeboard, and the certainty that when silence demanded courage, she answered. And because she did, 540 Marines lived to tell the story. One pilot overlooked, doubted, mocked. Viper 206. She refused to let protocol bury a battalion. She rewrote fate with patience and discipline. And when the time came, she proved that dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.